The 19th of November, 1944, dawned cold and misty across the French countryside near Burgultroff. A German soldier manning an anti-tank gun squinted through his optical sight at the American Sherman tanks rolling toward his position through the frozen morning air. For the past 72 hours, his unit had exchanged fire with these particular American armored forces, and with each engagement, everything Schmidt had learned in his Nazi training about racial hierarchies seemed increasingly divorced from the reality unfolding before his eyes. The Sherman at the head of the formation was clearly battle-damaged, smoke trailing from multiple hit locations, yet it continued its advance despite absorbing shot after shot. Through his magnified view, Schmidt could clearly make out the tank commander, undeniably a black man, standing exposed in the turret while operating the heavy machine gun mounted there, seemingly indifferent to the obvious danger surrounding him. This was Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers, though the German gunner wouldn't discover his adversary's identity until historians reconstructed this encounter many decades afterward. Severely wounded with a deep laceration cutting down to the bone in his leg, the sergeant had turned down morphine injections, refused medical evacuation, assumed control of a replacement tank, and pushed forward with his company toward Gabeling on the following day. Rivers had maintained his combat role for 3 consecutive days, despite a gangrenous wound that should have rendered any fighting man incapable of action. What Schmidt witnessed in those final moments before Rivers' tank took its fatal hit would remain with him for the remainder of his life, not primarily because of the combat violence itself, but because it completely shattered every principle about racial superiority that had been drilled into him. The supposedly inferior soldiers were demonstrating a level of bravery that surpassed anything he'd observed throughout 5 years of warfare. When the 761st Tank Battalion entered the Second World War, it represented far more than simply another American military formation joining the Allied effort. It embodied the collision between 2 fundamentally incompatible worldviews, with Nazi racial theories about to meet their complete and utter refutation on the field of battle. The battalion's unofficial motto declared they would come out fighting, and from their initial engagement at the small Belgian settlement of Morville-le-Vicq in November 1944 through intense combat operations continuing right up to the war's conclusion, that's precisely what they accomplished. Yet their struggle carried dual significance that German forces would soon comprehend in the most visceral manner imaginable. Among the German troops preparing to engage them were soldiers who'd been indoctrinated since childhood in concepts of racial supremacy. Wehrmacht training documentation explicitly stated that black soldiers couldn't operate sophisticated equipment, possessed no genuine courage, and would abandon their positions at the earliest indication of combat. These weren't merely casual biases, but foundational convictions that influenced German military doctrine and strategic expectations. The 761st would spend 183 consecutive days systematically demolishing every single one of these assumptions. The battalion received its official constitution on March 15, 1942, with activation following on April 1st of that same year at Camp Claiborne down in Louisiana. The activation stemmed not from any progressive military philosophy, but from what internal War Department memoranda characterized as political necessity to sustain Negro morale. The battalion's journey toward combat differed dramatically from that of any white unit. The soldiers of the 761st trained for nearly 2 full years, acutely aware that white units were deploying overseas after considerably shorter preparation periods. White armoured battalions typically shipped out after 12 to 16 weeks of training, yet the 761st would drill for more than 2 years, achieving mastery of every aspect of armoured combat, understanding that any error would be attributed not to them as individuals, but to their entire race. Lieutenant Colonel Paul Bates, the white officer commanding the battalion, was considered to have committed career suicide by accepting the position. Bates had served during the First World War and had personally witnessed French colonial troops fighting with genuine distinction. More significantly, he evaluated men based on capability rather than skin color. His assessment after those 2 years was unequivocal. The 761st represented the finest trained tank battalion in the entire United States Army. Among the men who would validate his judgment was Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers, hailing from Hotulka, Oklahoma, standing 6 feet and 2 inches tall, raised on a farm, possessing what Bates described as an intuitive grasp of terrain and tactical considerations. There was Warren Creasy, who would earn himself the nickname Iron Man through his exceptional combat stamina. And there was the battalion's most celebrated member who would never experience combat. First Lieutenant Jack Roosevelt Robinson, an athlete destined to become one of baseball's all-time greats, who lost his opportunity to see action when he refused to relocate to the rear section of a segregated military bus during an incident at Fort Hood, Texas in July 1944. Following their 2-year training session in Texas, the 761 Tank Battalion received deployment orders on June 9, 1944, just 3 days following the D-Day landings at Normandy. They crossed the Atlantic aboard the British transport vessel Esperance Bay, reaching England on September 8, 1944. After a brief period in England, the 761st disembarked in France via Omaha Beach on October 10, 1944. They were immediately placed under the command of General George Patton's Third Army. Patton's initial doubts regarding black tankers were thoroughly documented. He'd written to his wife expressing skepticism about their capacity to think with sufficient speed for armoured warfare. Nevertheless, on October 28, 1944, Patton delivered his now famous address to the battalion. He told them they were the first Negro tankers ever to fight in the American Army, that he would never have requested them if they weren't capable, that he maintained only the finest troops in his army, that he didn't give a damn what colour they were provided, they went up there and killed those German sons of bitches. He reminded them that everyone had their eyes fixed on them and anticipated great achievements. On November 7, 1944, the Black Panthers finally received their opportunity as they attacked the German-occupied town of Morville-le-Vicq, supporting the 26th Infantry Division. The German defenders, comprising a mixture of Wehrmacht infantry and anti-tank elements, anticipated an easy triumph against what they'd been informed were America's inferior troops. The engagement lasted 4 hours. The lead tank in King's section wasn't fortunate and got knocked out by a German Panzerfaust. 2 crew members from King's tank sustained wounds. Their fellow soldiers dragged them behind the tank to safety before proceeding to eliminate the soldier wielding the Panzerfaust. German after-action documentation, subsequently discovered in military archives, recorded with considerable surprise the remarkable tactical competence of the attacking tank formation. They'd anticipated panic when the first tank took a hit. Instead, the 761st executed a coordinated assault that methodically neutralized German positions. Another tank commander, Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers, encountered a German roadblock forcing his tank to halt. Under intense enemy small arms fire, he dismounted from the tank, secured a cable from his Sherman to the obstruction, remounted and had his tank drag the obstacle clear of the road, allowing the tank column to resume its advance and secure the town. Rivers received the Silver Star for this action, the first of numerous decorations the battalion would earn. November 1944 witnessed the 761st in continuous combat. The unit sustained 183 days of uninterrupted operational deployment. The 761st Tank Battalion suffered 156 casualties during November 1944 alone. 24 men killed, 81 wounded, and 44 non-battle losses. The unit also lost 14 tanks evacuated and another 20 damaged in combat. These stark statistics fail to capture what German forces were discovering. The black tankers they'd been assured would flee at initial contact were instead maintaining an operational tempo exceeding most white American units. While typical tank battalions rotated to rear areas after 10 to 14 days of combat, the 761 Saint tankers remained on the front lines continuously. German intelligence reports from this period, preserved in the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv, begin displaying confusion regarding the identity of these tankers. One report from the 11th Panzer Division observes that the enemy tank unit operating in Sector 7 displays exceptional vehicle maintenance and aggressive tactics inconsistent with intelligence assessments. The most dramatic illustration of the 761st's determination occurred during the assault on Gebling. On November 16, 1944, while advancing toward the town of Gebling, France, Staff Sergeant Rivers' tank struck a mine at a railroad crossing. Though severely wounded with his leg slashed to the bone, Rivers declined morphine injection, refused evacuation, assumed command of another tank, and advanced with his company into Gebling the following day. Captain David Williams, Rivers' company commander, repeatedly ordered his evacuation. Rivers' documented response was characteristic. "Captain, you know better than that. This is going to be tough. Another 2 days won't make any difference." A medic examining Rivers' swollen and infected leg looked up and shouted that he had gangrene. But Williams only had time to begin saying Reuben's name before German guns zeroed in, forcing the Americans into cover. On November 19, 1944, the end arrived. At dawn that day, Company A's tanks advanced toward Bergeltroff, their next objective, but enemy fire stopped them. Captain David Williams, the company commander, ordered his tanks to withdraw and seek cover. Staff Sergeant Rivers, however, radioed that he'd spotted the German anti-tank positions. "I see them," he transmitted. "We'll fight them." Rivers, joined by another Company A tank, opened fire on enemy tanks, providing cover as Company A withdrew. While doing so, Rivers' tank took a direct hit, killing him and wounding the remaining crew. Captain Williams immediately recommended Rivers for the Medal of Honor, though acting on that recommendation would require 52 years. December 16, 1944, brought the Wehrmacht's final major offensive, Operation Watch on the Rhine, known to Americans as the Battle of the Bulge. The 761st attached to the 87th Infantry Division and thrown into the desperate struggle to halt the German breakthrough. The battalion confronted some of Germany's finest remaining formations, including elements of the Führer Begleit Brigade, an elite formation expanded from the personal escort battalion of the German leader. The fighting around Tillit, Belgium, proved particularly savage. Replacements were difficult to obtain, and many new personnel assigned to join the Black Panthers arrived either raw and untrained or, being rejects from other units, completely unsuitable for duty. Despite receiving inadequate replacements, the 761st continued fighting. The combat was brutal, and the 761st Tank Battalion Shermans and 87th Division Infantry struggled against bitter resistance every step of the way. German forces included Tiger tanks, whose 88mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns couldn't penetrate the Tiger's armor. Yet the 761st developed tactics to compensate, exploiting their superior mobility to flank the heavier German tanks and their mechanical reliability to maintain more vehicles in operational status. One tanker, Sergeant Frank Cochran, shouted over the radio that they'd hit him 3 times, but he was still giving them hell. By January 9, 1945, Tillit was in American hands. The 761st had helped halt the German offensive, though at tremendous cost. February and March 1945 witnessed the 761st participating in the assault on the Siegfried Line, Germany's final major fortification system. The battalion attached to the 103rd Infantry Division for the assault. Within days, the Siegfried Line was breached, and enemy troops came forward to surrender in increasingly substantial numbers. By March 23rd, the Black Panthers had destroyed hundreds of enemy vehicles and heavy weapons, inflicted 4,000 casualties, and captured nearly as many prisoners. The combat here differed from France and Belgium. Now they operated on German soil, facing increasingly desperate resistance from Wehrmacht and Volkssturm units defending their homeland. Yet German soldiers were also beginning to surrender in larger numbers, particularly upon realizing they faced the black tankers they'd heard about. Prisoners were terrified of capture by black soldiers, believing due to their own propaganda that they could expect no mercy from such savages. The African Americans of the 761st learned not to emerge from their tank hatches until Germans came close, lest the surrendering troops see their black skin, howl in terror, and flee. This fear, based entirely on Nazi propaganda depicting black soldiers as savage and merciless, proved completely groundless. The 761st treated prisoners according to Geneva Convention protocols, frequently sharing their own rations with captured Germans. As the 761st crossed into Germany proper during March 1945, they encountered scenes revealing the true nature of the regime they fought. German civilians, conditioned by years of racial propaganda, were terrified of the black soldiers. Many fled rather than remain in areas occupied by the 761st. Yet the battalion maintained strict discipline. There were no reprisals against civilians, no looting, no revenge attacks, despite the racial hatred they knew these people had been taught. This professional conduct confused German civilians who'd expected the racial inferiors to behave like the savages depicted in Nazi propaganda. Tank battles continued as the 761st pushed deeper into Germany. They faced Panthers, Tigers, and desperate resistance from SS units. Warren Creasy, who'd earned his Iron Man nickname, was particularly notable during this period. He would often dismount his tank at night, carrying an M1 Garand rifle to conduct personal reconnaissance missions. One of the most profound moments in the 761st's combat history arrived on May 2nd, when the tankers liberated Gunskirchen concentration camp in Austria, discovering approximately 15,000 Hungarian Jews near death from starvation. The scene greeting the black tankers defied description. Thousands of skeletal figures, many unable to stand, filled the camp. The SS guards had fled days earlier, leaving the prisoners to die. Technician 5th grade Johnny Stevens later recalled seeing people who looked like skeletons, trying to smile, trying to wave, some crying. The soldiers gave them everything they had, rations, chocolate, everything. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. Nazi Germany's supposed racial inferiors were liberating the victims of racial hatred. One woman liberated by the unit, 17-year-old Sonja Schreiber-Weitz, described the soldier who saved her in a poem titled The Black Messiah. A black soldier stood by the door, she wrote. I never saw a black before. He'll set me free before I die, I thought. He must be the Messiah. By late April 1945, the 761 Saint would become one of the first American battalions to link up with Soviet forces. The meeting occurred at Steyr, Austria, in early May 1945, with sources varying between April 26th and May 5th to 6th. Tanker Leonard Smith received the shock of his life when a stout Russian woman tanker approached him, shouting, "America! America! America!" and swathed him in a tight hug until he could hardly breathe. The Soviet forces, including female tank crews, showed no surprise at seeing black American tankers. For them, what mattered was that these were fellow soldiers who'd survived the brutal fight against Nazi Germany. The 761st Tank Battalion's combat record speaks for itself. 183 consecutive days of combat from November 7th, 1944 through May 6th, 1945. 6 countries traversed: France, Belgium, Luxembourg, Netherlands, Germany, Austria. 4 major campaigns: Northern France, Rhineland, Ardennes, Alsace, Central Europe. Casualties inflicted: approximately 4,000 German casualties per National World War II museum records. German equipment destroyed. Hundreds of vehicles, 31 pillboxes, 49 machine gun emplacements, 29 anti-tank guns captured. Unit casualties, nearly 50% casualty rate from an initial strength of 36 officers, 30 black and 6 white, and 676 enlisted men. Tanks lost, 71 total. Awards: 1 Medal of Honor posthumously to Reuben Rivers in 1997, 7 Silver Stars, 70 Bronze Stars, approximately 246 to 300 Purple Hearts. While specific Wehrmacht documents mentioning the 761st by designation are limited, German reactions to black American troops are thoroughly documented in military archives and prisoner interrogations. One surrendering German officer asked how many Negro Panzer divisions existed. When informed there was only one battalion, he refused to believe it. The continuous presence of the 761st over 183 days had created the impression of a much larger force. German prisoners repeatedly expressed surprise at the combat effectiveness of black troops. Interrogation reports from 1945, now housed in the United States National Archives, show German soldiers struggling to reconcile what they'd witnessed with what they'd been taught about racial superiority. One captured Wehrmacht sergeant told interrogators they'd been informed the Negroes would run at the first shot. Instead, they kept coming even when their tanks were knocked out. This was not what they expected. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, but the 761st's fight was far from over. Like their white comrades, African American tankers struggled with memories and in some cases post-traumatic stress. Unlike white soldiers, however, black soldiers dealt with segregation and the often savage racial prejudice characteristic of this period in American history. Texas native Staff Sergeant Floyd Day Jr. described the contradictions for black soldiers returning to the United States in an oral history, noting they didn't have equal rights and democracy was against them. The men who'd destroyed German tanks and liberated concentration camps returned to an America where they couldn't eat in many restaurants, had to sit at the back of buses, and faced violent racism. German prisoners of war held in the United States were often treated better than the black soldiers who'd captured them. For 33 years, the 761st Tank Battalion's achievements went officially unrecognized at the unit level. Individual medals were awarded, but the Presidential Unit citation that white battalions received immediately was denied. It wasn't until January 24, 1978, that President Jimmy Carter awarded the Presidential Unit citation to the 761. The citation read in part that the 761st Tank Battalion distinguished itself by extraordinary gallantry, courage, professionalism, and high esprit de corps displayed in the accomplishment of unusually difficult and hazardous operations. The ultimate recognition came in 1997 when 7 members of the battalion, including Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers, posthumously received the Medal of Honor. Not until over 50 years later, on January 12, 1997, was the Medal of Honor finally bestowed on Platoon Sergeant Reuben Rivers. President Clinton noted at the ceremony that no African American who deserved the Medal of Honor for service in World War II received it at the time. One of the most interesting transformations involved General Patton himself. Despite his initial skepticism about black soldiers, Patton's assessment of the 761st changed dramatically through their service. During the Battle of the Bulge, when German soldiers who'd raided American warehouses were reported to have disguised themselves as Americans guarding checkpoints to ambush American soldiers, Patton solved this problem by ordering black soldiers, including the 761st, to guard the checkpoints, with orders to shoot any white soldiers at the checkpoints who acted suspiciously. This order demonstrated remarkable trust. Patton was literally placing the security of his entire army in the hands of black soldiers he'd once doubted could think fast enough for armoured warfare. By war's end, Patton had recommended the 761 Saint for numerous commendations. While his personal racial views remained complex and problematic, his military assessment of the battalion was unequivocal. They were among his best units. Ironically, the racism that kept the 761st training for 2 years instead of the standard few months became their greatest advantage. This extensive training meant that when the 761st finally entered combat, they were possibly the best prepared tank battalion in the American Army. They could perform maintenance in complete darkness, had memorized every aspect of their tank's operation, and had developed unit cohesion that only comes from extended time together. Lieutenant Colonel Paul Bates later testified that the delay in sending them to combat, which was wrong and racist, accidentally created the best-trained tank battalion in the Army. They could do things with Shermans that shouldn't have been possible. While Reuben Rivers received the most recognition, Warren Creasy's story deserves special attention. Known as Iron Man, Creasy survived the entire war despite being wounded multiple times and destroying extraordinary amounts of German equipment. During one engagement, Creasy's tank was knocked out by German fire. Instead of withdrawing, he took control of a .50 caliber machine gun on a half-track and used it to cover his crew's escape while destroying the German position. He would often volunteer for the most dangerous assignments, leading reconnaissance missions on foot behind enemy lines. Creasy survived the war, but like many veterans, struggled with what would now be recognized as PTSD. He rarely spoke about his experiences, and it wasn't until the 1978 Presidential Unit Citation that his extraordinary service received proper recognition. One aspect of the 761st's service that surprised German forces was their mechanical proficiency. Nazi propaganda had insisted black soldiers couldn't operate complex machinery. Instead, the 761st maintained one of the highest operational readiness rates in the Third Army. This was partly due to their extended training, but also to the dedication of men like technician 5th grade William Harvey, who could diagnose engine problems by sound alone. The battalion's maintenance crews worked through the night, often under fire, to keep tanks running. German reports expressed bewilderment at seeing damaged Sherman tanks they thought were destroyed back in action within hours. The 761st's ability to maintain their vehicles under combat conditions exceeded that of many veteran Wehrmacht units. Facing superior German tanks like Tigers and Panthers, the 761st developed innovative tactics. The Sherman's 75mm gun often couldn't penetrate the frontal armour of German heavy tanks, so the 761st perfected flanking manoeuvres they called cat hunting. One Sherman would act as bait, drawing fire and revealing the German position. Two others would then race to flanking positions, targeting the thinner side and rear armour. This required extraordinary coordination and courage. The bait tank was often destroyed. These tactics were studied and adopted by other American armoured units. The 761st's combat innovations contributed to the overall improvement of American armoured doctrine in the European theatre. During the Battle of the Bulge, the 761 played a crucial role in relieving the encircled 101 Airborne Division at Bastogne. While Patton's relief of Bastogne is well known, the role of the 761 is often overlooked. Fighting through terrible winter conditions with temperatures dropping to -20 degrees Fahrenheit, the battalion helped punch through German lines. They faced not just regular Wehrmacht, but also SS units, making desperate attempts to maintain the encirclement. The 101st Airborne, surrounded and running low on everything, watched as the 761st's Shermans broke through German lines. One paratrooper later recalled they didn't care what colour they were the most beautiful sight they'd ever seen. The 761st produced exceptional combat leaders. Captain Erwin McHenry, Captain John Long and Lieutenant Charles Barber all demonstrated tactical brilliance under fire. These black officers commanded not through formal military hierarchy, but through earned respect and demonstrated competence. Captain David Williams, who commanded Company A, submitted more Medal of Honor recommendations for his men than any other company commander in the battalion. Most were downgraded or ignored due to racial prejudice, only being properly recognized decades later. The 761st's success came partly from their exceptional cooperation with infantry units. Despite initial prejudice from white infantry units, the tankers' combat performance quickly earned respect. During the assault on Klimbach, France, white infantrymen specifically requested the 761st's support, having seen their effectiveness in previous engagements. The battalion's consistent willingness to provide close support, often at great risk, saved countless infantry lives. One infantry sergeant wrote home that the coloured tank boys saved their bacon more times than he could count, that they'd drive right into German fire to give them cover, and that he didn't care what anyone said back home because these men were heroes. The 761st's aggressive combat style was reflected in their ammunition consumption. They fired over 300 tons of ammunition during their deployment, an extraordinary amount for a single battalion. This wasn't wasteful shooting, but sustained, accurate fire that reflected their extensive training. German after-action reports frequently noted the accuracy of American tank fire in sectors where the 761 Saint operated. As casualties mounted, the 761st faced a unique problem. The segregated army had limited numbers of trained black tank crew replacements. Many new men assigned to join the Black Panthers were raw and untrained or, being rejects from other units, totally unfit for duty. This meant experienced crew members couldn't be rotated out for rest. Exhausted men continued fighting because there was no one to replace them. This contributed to both the extraordinary heroism and the high casualty rate. The presence of the 761st created problems for German propaganda. Soldiers who'd faced them couldn't reconcile their experience with official Nazi racial theory. Wehrmacht morale reports from early 1945 note increasing skepticism about racial propaganda among troops who'd faced black American units. Soldiers were asking if the racial theory was true, why were they losing to inferior races? This cognitive dissonance contributed to the collapse of fighting spirit in many German units during the war's final months. Before deployment, the 761st had trained in the American South under Jim Crow conditions. Most black tankers trained at installations in southern states like Kentucky, Louisiana, and Texas. In the days before civil rights advances made in the United States in the 1960s, black people were still treated harshly in the South and often considered inferior by white residents. At Camp Hood, Texas, they faced constant racial harassment. Local businesses refused to serve them. Military buses were segregated. The battalion was housed in the worst part of the base near the sewage treatment plant. Yet this adversity forged extraordinary unity. The men of the 761 Saint knew they were fighting two wars, one against the Germans, another against racism. This dual purpose gave them a determination that German forces couldn't understand or overcome. The most famous member of the 761st was First Lieutenant Jack Roosevelt Robinson. During the 761st's training, a white bus driver told Robinson to move to the back of the bus. Robinson refused and was arrested. Battalion Commander Lieutenant Colonel Paul Bates refused to consider the court-martial charges put forward by the arresting military policeman. The post commander transferred Robinson to the 758th Tank Battalion, whose commander was willing to sign the insubordination court-martial order. Robinson was court-martialed but acquitted on all charges. However, the legal proceedings meant he missed the 761st's deployment to Europe. He received an honourable discharge in November 1944 and would go on to break baseball's colour barrier in 1947. On November 10, 2005, a monument to the 761st Tank Battalion was unveiled at Fort Hood, now Fort Cavazos, Texas. The monument features 4 black granite tablets surrounding a life-size marble sculpture of a 761st Tank Battalion fighter kneeling atop a black granite pedestal engraved with a tank on the front and a panther on the back. The dedication was attended by surviving veterans, their families, and military officials. The keynote speaker noted that the 761st had fought not just for victory over Nazi Germany, but for the principle that all Americans, regardless of race, could serve their country with distinction. Perhaps the most meaningful validation came from an unexpected source. In the 1990s, American military historians interviewing former Wehrmacht veterans about tank warfare encountered consistent mentions of exceptional American tank units. When asked to identify these units, German veterans frequently described the black tankers who'd fought with particular ferocity and skill. These were men who had no reason to praise their former enemies, yet they consistently identified the 761st as among the best tank units they'd faced. One former German tank commander stated simply that they fought like devils, that they couldn't understand why men their own country treated as inferior fought so hard for it, and that now he thought perhaps that was why, because they had something to prove, and they proved it. The human cost of the 761st Service was severe. With nearly 50% casualties, the battalion paid a heavy price for their achievement. Families received telegrams informing them that their sons, husbands and fathers had died fighting for a country that didn't grant them full citizenship rights. Yet survivors rarely expressed bitterness about this contradiction. Leonard Smith, who became a New York City transit officer after the war, said in a 1995 interview that they knew what they were fighting for was bigger than the prejudice they faced, that they were fighting for what America could be, not what it was. For decades, the 761st story was largely unknown outside the black community. History books, when they mentioned black soldiers at all, typically focused on support units. The combat achievements of units like the 761st were minimized or ignored. This began to change in the 1970s with the civil rights movement's emphasis on recovering black history. The 1978 Presidential Unit Citation brought national attention. The 1997 Medal of Honor ceremony brought even more. Today, the 761st Tank Battalion is recognized as one of the most effective armored units in the European theater. Their story is taught at the United States Army Armor School, studied at military academies, and honored in museums. The story of the 761st Tank Battalion remains relevant today. It demonstrates that prejudice and discrimination waste human potential. The Army's initial reluctance to use black soldiers in combat roles nearly deprived it of one of its best tank battalions. It also shows that excellence cannot be suppressed by prejudice. Despite facing discrimination from their own country and deadly hatred from their enemies, the men of the 761 Tank Battalion achieved extraordinary things through skill, courage, and determination. Their story challenges us to examine our own prejudices and preconceptions. If Nazi Germany, one of history's most militarily proficient nations, could be so catastrophically wrong about racial capabilities, what assumptions do we make today that might be equally false? The 761st's combat record became a powerful argument for military integration. When President Truman signed Executive Order 9981 in 1948 desegregating the armed forces, the combat achievements of units like the 761 Saint were specifically cited as evidence that segregation weakened military effectiveness. During the Korean War, integrated units performed exceptionally well, validating what the 761 had proven, that competence and courage know no racial boundaries. Many veterans of the 761 served as advisors during this integration process, sharing lessons learned from their unique experience. Individual veterans of the 761st faced varied post-war experiences. Some, like E.G. McConnell, used the GI Bill to get college educations that would have been impossible before the war. Others faced continued discrimination in employment and housing despite their service. Many struggled with PTSD, then called combat fatigue, for years after the war. Like many veterans, they rarely spoke about their experiences. It wasn't until the 1978 Presidential Unit Citation that many families learned the full extent of their relatives' heroism. The full story of the 761st has been pieced together from various sources: official army records, German military archives, personal letters and diaries, and oral histories collected decades later. Each source adds details to the picture of extraordinary service under impossible circumstances. The United States Army's official history, published in the 1950s, barely mentioned the 761st. It took independent historians and the veterans themselves to ensure their story was preserved. Today, the National Archives holds extensive records of the battalion's service, available to researchers and the public. The 761st's liberation of Gunskirchen concentration camp is commemorated at Yad Vashem, Israel's official memorial to Holocaust victims. Survivors and their descendants have maintained connections with battalion veterans and their families. In 2015, the Austrian government invited surviving members of the 761st to ceremonies marking the 70th anniversary of the war's end. They were honoured not just as liberators, but as men who'd shown humanity in the midst of inhuman circumstances. The German Tigers and Panthers never expected the 761st Black Panthers to fight at all, much less to fight for 183 consecutive days without relief. Nazi racial ideology had assured them that black soldiers were incapable of operating tanks, lacking in courage, and would flee at first contact. Instead, they encountered men who'd trained longer, fought harder, and endured more than almost any other American unit. The 761st didn't just help defeat Nazi Germany. They demolished its racial ideology through undeniable combat excellence. From the time they entered combat until the end of the war in Europe, the men of the 761 received 7 Silver Stars, 246 Purple Hearts, and 1 Congressional Medal of Honor. These decorations, many awarded decades late due to racial prejudice, only hint at the full extent of their heroism. The 761st Tank Battalion fought for 183 days without relief, not because they weren't exhausted, they were, not because they didn't suffer casualties, they lost nearly half their men. They fought because they carried the hopes and dignity of millions of black Americans who were told they weren't good enough to serve their country in combat. Every Sherman tank they drove into battle carried more than ammunition. It carried the weight of representation, the burden of proof, and the determination to demonstrate that courage and competence know no colour. Every German position they destroyed struck a blow not just against the Wehrmacht, but against the racial prejudices of 2 nations, their enemies and their own. The German forces that faced them learned a lesson that challenged everything they'd been taught. The black soldiers they'd been told were subhuman proved to be extraordinary humans. The inferior troops demonstrated superior courage. The men who shouldn't have been able to operate complex machinery mastered tank warfare at the highest level. In the end, the 761st Tank Battalion's greatest victory wasn't capturing towns or destroying enemy tanks. It was proving beyond any doubt, in the most extreme circumstances imaginable, that excellence is not determined by race but by training, determination, and character. They were the Black Panthers. They came out fighting. And for 183 days without relief, against enemies who never expected them to fight at all, they never stopped. Their legacy lives on, not just in military history, but in the ongoing struggle for equality and recognition that their sacrifice helped advance. The German Tigers expected easy prey. They found instead the Black Panthers and learned that everything they believed about race and war was wrong.